it's an honor to be on this panel with these very distinguished panelists as well. And just to add a little bit of my own perspective regarding diaspora voting and representation. I think just going back to your question from the previous speakers, as well as especially with the keynote by Mr. Bahum. I mean, there's no question regarding the right to vote for, the diaspora, which is provided for in under Section 26 and 39, as he rightly said, under the 1997 Constitution, but also in terms of the fact that Section 11 of the Elections Act also mandates the IEC to maintain a register. And the idea is that the right to vote places an obligation on the state, not just to refrain from preventing people from voting, but to make sure that positive mechanisms are in place to actually realize those rights. We do know in reality that whilst the right to vote for all citizens, including the diaspora and Gambians living abroad, is provided for, it's an unimplemented right. So that means both the IEC and government in general have actually failed in ensuring the realization of these rights. I think in a sense, and I think the IEC representative, Mr. Njai, stipulated earlier, as well as Mr. Bahum and everybody else, that the Electoral Act that we currently have is actually under review, and I'm not sure it's going to be adopted before the presidential election, possibly. But I think in terms of ensuring the implementation of the provision that we have in the Constitution, there needs to be the law. We need law reform, which is currently ongoing, which needs to be more explicit in terms of effectively setting out how the constitutional right to vote in this sense will be fulfilled. So specifically the IEC, and I think just to reiterate Mr. Kebe's point, do have an obligation, as I said, under the Electoral Act to ensure that they have a voter register of Gambians, which includes Gambians living abroad, which I think, as highlighted in the discussion, we don't currently have. So that means they are failing in that sense. And the efforts by Mr. Kebe and others means that it's a starting point for the IAC to ensure that they're able to exercise that obligation in terms of mapping and having a database of this population, which is very important as well. But I think, and just to go back, and I think my comment will also reiterate Mr. Kebe's point about this idea that probably, especially in terms of law reform, in terms of looking at the avenues for voting, we need to also look at alternative avenues for voting. So not just in person, as Mr. Kebe rightly said, there are going to be very many logistical problems and challenges regarding that, I guess. And some of the alternatives that he said in terms of either postal voting, electoral voting, and advanced voting, and all of those things might be better alternative or good alternatives in terms of just in-person voting. And the IEC, especially Ministry of Justice, in terms of law reform currently ongoing, need to effectively and consistently actually consult with interested and affected parties, as they are currently doing, in terms of ensuring that they're able to find an alternative that guarantees the legitimacy and transparency of the process. Because if it's clearly stipulated that it's just in-person voting, that's going to, as I said, going to be problematic. And I think it also goes back to this idea that one of the people that do not really support diaspora voting. So one of the challenges that they've been highlighting is this idea that, you always have a low voter turnout, despite the fact that there are so much resources pumped into it. And I think, just as Mr. Kebe rightly said, in terms of ensuring that we do not invest so much resources into this and end up not having, enough people turning up, it's important that we do have alternative means. So probably in terms of the law reform, it can, whilst it can talk about in-person voting, it might be able to have alternative options of voting, and I think this might be useful. But I also just wanted to highlight something. I know it's not related to your question, but with regard to Mr. Bahum's comment about representation, especially with dual citizenship and the effect of that, especially in terms of Section 712 and Section 91, in terms of this idea that, if you're a dual citizen, you might not be able to run for presidency or serve in the cabinet or, run for elections, for parliamentary elections in a sense. And I think in terms of Section 7212, it's an entrenched clause in the 1997 Constitution. So that means that if we want representation in terms of presidency and representation in the cabinet, that will likely require a referendum, which we do know that currently with our constitutional reform, we're in a predicament, right? So the draft constitution, which is more progressive than the 1997 constitution that we have, was rejected. So, there are efforts, as everybody rightly said, in terms of trying to re-energize and repump in terms of bringing back, or alternatively, just having a new constitution that is more progressive than the 1997 constitution that have been amended more than 50 times and doesn't really represent the aspirations and the wishes of the Gambian people. So in terms of thinking ahead of a new constitution, one of the things that can be included is this idea that, but I know that that is also very a contentious issue, a contested debate around whether people that have dual citizenship will issues around loyalty, about patriotism and so forth. But I think some of the alternatives or proposals have been that in some instances where somebody with dual citizen, for instance, where the second country, if there is a debate or policy debate or considerations that have to be done with the second country, the person can recuse themselves. I mean, we in the courts as well, if there are conflict of interest, people, lawyers and judges can recuse themselves. So this might be an alternative way of doing that. But I think in terms of representation in the National Assembly and having constituency for the diaspora, I think is possible in terms of engagement with the National Assembly, but generally engagement with in terms of pushing for this idea of fulfilling and enhancing the legitimacy process.